it's a real pleasure to be able to attend and to discuss Britain and the international rule of law. I think it's particularly appropriate to be addressing this subject in this place, which of course is famed throughout the world for its own rule and its contribution to the development of the rule of law, and for providing, I might add, a congenial environment for so many politicians like myself and lots of other practitioners to take stock of and consider the future development of the concept. What I wanted to do this afternoon was I hope I might be able to offer a few thoughts on that issue, after which I think the floor will be opened up, and I expect there will be a wide-ranging and free-flowing exchange of views. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I address the subject, I want to ensure all of you are aware of the government's position on an important issue. There's been a lot of speculation over some time now, but it is right for me to confirm that the government has been engaged in the active supply of arms and related war materiel to a group of determined rebels operating against a foreign government overseas. Due to the complaints of that government, we were aware that these British-supplied arms materially assisted the rebels in their struggle. This supply of weaponry began as a covert activity, but it's right that I acknowledge now on behalf of the British government and echo an earlier expression of regret for the damage caused and confirm that the government position remains that international arbitration is the best means of adjudicating any remaining claims. Now, I'm speaking, of course, of the CSS Alabama, a Confederate sloop of war which roamed the seas harrying Union merchant shipping during the American Civil War. That warship, secretly built on the Mersey in 1862 by expert British shipbuilders, armed with the latest cannonry and deck weaponry, powered by sail and steam engine screws, was supplied to the Confederate rebels by the then British Prime Minister, or at least on his instruction. It took over 65 prizes around the world at a cost to the Union of an estimated $123 million in today's money. After the war, US outrage at this incident as evidence of general British perfidy towards the Union during the Civil War led to pressure from the US for compensation. After discussions over several years, this led to the 1871 Treaty of Washington, which settled on arbitration as the means by which the Alabama claims and other bilateral disputes would be settled. That arbitration led to the payment of the then unprecedented sum of $15.5 million. It paved the way for a rapprochement between the US and the UK, and in fact was the father of all subsequent interstate arbitrations. While the Alabama claims is perhaps the most framed example of its kind, I think its prominence sometimes obscures the fact that numerous US-UK arbitrations had in fact preceded it, mainly arising out of border issues, compensation claims from the War of Independence, and that after the Alabama case, Britain went on to arbitrate disputes with Portugal, the Netherlands, and Venezuela. These instances, together with the UK's firm support for the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 1899 and 1907, have led Sir Michael Wood to describe Britain in those early years as a hesitant pioneer of international dispute settlement. But the story thereafter actually gets even better. After the First World War, Britain championed the establishment of a permanent court of justice. Since 1930, the UK has accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the court and its modern successor, the International Court of Justice, almost without a break. This commitment to binding international dispute settlement is in fact, I think, without parallel amongst major powers. In particular, it remains the case that Britain stands alone among the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council in accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of the court. Of course, international dispute settlement is not by itself the only indication of a steadfast commitment to the international rule of law. In modern times, Lord Bingham, in whose shadow those of us who dare to speak on the subject of the rule of law always remain, was clear that an essential element of the national rule of law was that a nation commit to comply with its international obligations. That remains the position of this government, a view which has been enshrined in the ministerial code for many years now. But it also stems from a long history of respect for our treaty commitments, which, as many of us will again recall as we approach the centenary of the start of the First World War, led to the British Empire entering into hostilities to respect our treaty obligations to guarantee Belgian neutrality, what the then German Chancellor subsequently decried as a scrap of paper. Back in the present day, deep in the bowels of the Foreign Office, in dusty, unlit corridors, to which I have at least on one occasion had the privilege to have access to just look at the sheer quantity of paper, there is a tiny gathering of dedicated people who maintain a steady record of all of Britain's treaty commitments going back centuries. If we are to assume for one moment that the modern era begins in 1834, when regular recording began in what later became the Foreign Office, these treaty experts have told me, because I decided I would ask before I came to do this lecture, that there are some 13,200 records of treaties and agreements which the United Kingdom has signed and ratified. Many thousands of these agreements are still applicable, and they range in importance from the United Nations Charter to local treaties over fishing rights or maritime access. Of those, perhaps around 700 contain reference to the possibility of binding dispute settlement. Today, all treaties must be laid before Parliament, where they may be debated. And if they involve the need to change UK law, Parliament must scrutinise and enact any necessary legislation before the UK consents to be bound. In this age of globalisation, activities previously considered of purely domestic scope often have an international component, whether on coordinated economic action, climate change, the regulation of pesticides on bee populations. Without the UK's reputation for upholding its word and ability to act internationally to address regional or global problems, any government action to confront those challenges would remain partial or ineffective. Although I suppose the French and Dutch may disagree, there is in fact plenty of evidence to demonstrate that the concept of the rule of law is at its heart a British one. And our commitment to that principle on the world stage is central in us being able to deal with those issues. While we should remain intensely proud of our island roots and traditions, no country, in my judgment, can stand alone as an island in the 21st century. This self-evident truth is recognised across the world and has only grown in power alongside the re-emergence of global economic giants like China, Russia, India, or Brazil. Now, these countries profess a strong commitment to the international rule of law, and their ability to influence others in the world will continue to be measured by how their actions live up to those sentiments. But what is clear is that every country, even those frankly quite outside the fold of respectability, adopt the language of international law and try to frame their arguments using the parameters of international rules. Few, except perhaps the most ardent of right-wing academics, asserts that there is no such thing as international law or that it should be ignored. And for emerging powers like China, India, or Brazil, international law is still seen as a cloak of protection to safeguard them from the previous doctrine of might is right. More than ever in international fora like the United Nations, the debate about what can be done in respect of a given international problem is driven by principles of international law and the options and restraints provided for by the applicable legal framework. This international trend is set only to continue, particularly as we encourage the active development of international criminal law and its stated aim to end impunity for the most serious crimes of international concern. When we review Britain's situation right now, we should, I think, bear in mind its outstanding pedigree on dispute settlement and respect for treaty obligations. the increasing importance of international agreement as a means of dealing with problems ranging far beyond traditional notions of foreign affairs. Against this background, it should be no surprise that my friend and colleague William Hague has made the international rule of law a central plank of his new focused approach to British foreign policy. If we're to remain secure and prosperous in this new century, the British body politic has to ensure that it does not lose sight of the value in being a central player in developing the international system of mutually binding rules that determine how we as countries, companies, or individuals conduct ourselves on matters that affect each other's interests. It's crucial that we should be frank with ourselves what this means. We should not sign up for every obscure international agreement or organisation available. Britain has no need, I suggest, to burnish its international credentials in this way. In the context of international adjudication, our commitment to dispute settlement should remain tailored to ensure that frivolous, long-forgotten, or inappropriate claims cannot be made. We should view foreign policy with a hard-edged but enlightened self-interest, vigorously pursue what we think is in our interests and will serve to confront the most serious global challenges. However, even with a first-class diplomatic service and the involvement of top-class minds among government, not everything is always going to go our way. Whereas our successes will be confined to the worthy pages of legal journals, we can guarantee that our legal failures will continue to be emblazoned on the tabloid front pages. In recent decades, we have succeeded in defending our position in international tribunals on nuclear power, securing continental shelf claims in the Bay of Biscay, very important topic, and in defending the UK's position on VAT from the European Commission, perhaps actually even more important. We have been less successful in some other areas, in the Strasbourg court in dealing with terrorist suspects, in arbitration with the Eurotunnel over border security, or at the UN with our claims around Ascension Island. But despite the prospect of such setbacks to important immediate interests, as a government and as a body politic, we need to ensure that a clear-eyed assessment of the national interest continues to focus on the medium to long term. The economic and physical security of the United Kingdom remains rooted in international engagement, and the fact that the decisions of the institutional infrastructure do not necessarily always favour our approach and can be politically very unwelcome and irritating should not deter us from the path of maintaining Britain's strategic advantage. In fact, if we're to convince those that will join us as the powers of tomorrow that it's in their interest to work within this system, we do need to ensure that we're not in fact loosening the bonds of the rule of law. This doesn't mean, however, that we can't continue to actively seek reform of institutions that need to reform, evolve, or even in some cases probably be killed off to ensure that the institutional framework keeps pace with the needs of the modern world. Britain continues to work with its closest partners in leading the charge for strengthening and deepening the international rule of law across the board. We're doing this politically by championing reform of the UN, expansion of the Security Council, to changing the EU to focus on trade and to more closely reflect the views of its citizens, to ensure that the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg remains a beacon of freedom in Europe and does not interfere in what should be decided by democratic parliaments. We're doing this in the economic sphere by working to ensure the global system delivers prosperity and protects those in the most need in the G8, G20, and the EU. In dealing with specific global problems, we're leading the way towards global solutions on climate change, free trade, and the arms industry. Where we think that the answer to a problem with an international dimension is international action, often the tools of international law can help us to deliver and implement such action. And of course, international law should not stand still. Where international regulation is hampering current activities, whether it might be in the Human Rights Court not having the proper judicial deference to local democratic decision-making, or international rules which are no longer fit for purpose, we should certainly be looking at cutting through this international red tape just as we would do domestically. But where we need to do this, and our efforts at reform and renegotiation have failed, we should, in the last resort, not take any actions which would disregard treaty obligations which continue to bind us. As we look beyond the headlines of today and focus on delivering these ambitious goals for the future, we can also draw on the rich traditions of our past. Just as the world once had an insatiable appetite for British manufactured goods and textiles, and our methods were sought by fair means or foul by countries across the globe looking to advance their own development, there is now a great demand for us to export the principles and practices of British justice and the rule of law, whether taught here to those that will practice abroad or delivered directly by British practitioners. In order to do that, we must ensure that the rule of law industry can continue to thrive and adapt here in modern Britain. But we should not forget that there is effectively a hungry overseas market crying out for those educated and experienced in British justice. The government is involved in supporting, encouraging, or just showing appreciation to a great number of projects, where experts on aspects of British justice trained in this country and steeped in what that bastion of British rule of law, Rumpole of the Bailey, might have called the golden threads running through our system, have ventured abroad to offer as part of their services to community in need. Let me just give you a few examples. One is the British co-prosecutor at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. Andrew Cayley has been labouring in Phnom Penh for 4 years, working in a system that is certainly not accustomed to British standards of independence or evidential rigour. Despite this, he's managed to secure a high-profile conviction and commence proceedings against some of the most serious suspects. On the other side of the courtroom sit people like Judge Howard Morrison QC, currently a judge in the case of Radovan Karadzic at the Yugoslav Tribunal in The Hague. Howard spent years toiling away in countries such as Rwanda, Iraq, and the South Pacific, trying to secure the fair administration of trials and engender respect for principles of justice, often in the most hostile and challenging of environments. Another practitioner who's a delight to see here today is Sir Michael Wood. Building on his years at the helm in the Foreign Office, Sir Michael's developed an impressive practice at the International Bar, where there's rarely, as far as I can see, a new case that doesn't feature him on one side or the other. The same might easily also be said of Vaughan Lowe, Philip Sands, Alan Boyle, or other notable expert counsel from all parts of the UK, or individuals who are eminent in deciding cases like Judge Greenwood in The Hague, Judge Vida in Luxembourg, or Judge Marnie in Strasbourg. Away from individuals, there's clearly also a lot of good work going on among British law firms, particularly in relation to international pro bono work. Herbert Smith Freehills have been identified among the market leaders in London in offering more than 1 million of billable time to the government of Sierra Leone in what must be one of the most laudable examples of international pro bono work in the city today. Moving away from the private sector to people working directly for government or seconded from it, the international division of the CPS continues to be a self-funding entity designed to make available the expertise of British prosecutors to places as far afield as the Seychelles, the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, to deal with issues such as piracy or the drugs trade. For myself, as Attorney General, I had, on assuming office, rather expected to be largely confined to my desk in Westminster, focusing on domestic legal issues. But the reality of the job has been very different. It's involved a significant amount of international engagement and travel. What's been marked as I've talked to foreign counterparts is their attitude and approach to our justice system. My varied and diverse discussions have included talks with Afghan politicians in Helmand province, Palestinians working for justice in the occupied Palestinian territories, Israelis dealing with the threat of terrorism on their streets, Gulf countries looking to reform and develop their own systems, and other close allies such as the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. What all of them have in common is a deep sense of respect for the British system and our traditions, a desire for help or to share experience with us in this field, and often a specifically professed desire for explicitly British assistance in this area. While the government's engaged in a serious way in significant direct assistance, what's particularly pleasing is that a lot of the assistance that we can and do provide, particularly to less well-developed countries, does not drain the public purse, as it's actually delivered with expertise and enthusiasm by the host of voluntary actors in the field. I would add that as Attorney General, I chair both the domestic and international pro bono groups. It's a representative role, but I'm there to champion their work. I've never ceased to be overwhelmingly impressed about the work that's done at an international level, and is hugely to the credit of our country and an enhancement of its reputation. So we've established that the rule of law is central to our international policies, and that there are a number of bold men and women who are going out and offering a quality supply to meet the ready demand. Part of this is, of course, self-interested. Interested living can be made in this way, and British practitioners can use their international work to get instructed on a commercial basis in some cases. But part of it too, it's clear to me, is a pride in the way we work in these areas, and the feeling that we can offer much to those overseas as they build and develop their own traditions of the rule of law. Getting into this area has never been easier, with institutions like Chatham House providing valuable forums where these issues are discussed, and groups like my International Pro Bono Committee that I've just mentioned, helping to coordinate assistance and maximise the impact of the aid given. Looking back to the Alabama claims arbitration, it is clear that Britain has come a long way since those early pioneering days. We've continued to be at the heart of the developing infrastructure which supports the international rule of law. Looking into the future remains in our core long-term interests to ensure that respect for international law and institutions endures, even when it is politically inexpedient. In addition to that core foreign policy interest, British people from all backgrounds and professions continue to export our values and traditions on the rule of law overseas. In these times of intense international competition, British expertise in the administration of justice is a commodity which we should do our utmost to ensure we market. As Attorney General, it gives me great pride to stand as part of a system that many people throughout the world so closely associate with what makes us uniquely British. Thank you very much.